This is a full review of the Canon C200, including sample footage, a run through of all the features, what I like and don't like about it, as well as where this fits into the landscape of other cinema camera options at the price point of $7,500 here in late 2017. Currently, I own two Canon C100 Mark IIs that I've been using for about 3 years now, and I also just recently got a red Scarlett W, which shoots 5K, and this Canon C200 fits somewhere between the two. So I rented it from Lens Pro to Go with my own money to do this review and to see if it's worth upgrading my C100s that I still use a lot for my client work, B cams and C cams, or if I should just stick with C100s for now. Let's get started about what I like about this camera. So first up, I really like the touchscreen autofocus. Canon's dual pixel autofocus system is really the best one out there for any kind of video camera hybrid that uses still lenses. With autofocus modes like the face tracking autofocus with any Canon EF or EFS lens, unlike on the C100 Mark II, which limits which lenses you can use the face tracking on, or the object tracking, which allows you to actually pick a specific object that you want to have the camera track, and it'll do a pretty good job of tracking the focus as subjects move in and out. One thing to be careful of when you are using this touchscreen is if you press it too hard, your camera will probably shake. So it is really sensitive, so if you barely place your finger on the screen, it will pick that up and allow you to change focus without adding too much shake to the camera. The other thing I really like about the autofocus on this is how adjustable it is. You can change the speed and responsiveness so that when you touch the screen, it doesn't automatically focus. You can slow that down so if you do shake the camera, the rack focus won't happen for a little bit. So if you wanted it to change super fast between two objects, maybe you're doing action sports and you just want to make sure that when you touch the screen, it gets in focus very quickly. Or if you're trying to do a slow rack focus, you can lower that speed when you touch the screen to change focus between two objects. It has a nice natural transition. Number two, the UHD 16:9 quote 4K image that this produces is pretty great. Now it either is in a raw light format or an MP4 format right now, and I'll get to more of that later, but the quality on these files is really, really high with the compression that they put on them. After spending almost 3 years looking at C100 Mark II footage with a nice sensor in that camera, although downscaled to 1080p, going to look at some of the footage from the C200, it's a nice visual upgrade, not just in resolution, but in the depth of the image and the colors as well. The third thing I like about this camera is it does continue the use of both wide DR and Canon log, and it adds Canon log 3 to enable you to get a really wide dynamic range of what you're filming if you're in an environment that's not fully controlled. So you have a really bright sky, someone in the shadows, and you want to keep as much detail as possible. Well, using Canon log or Canon log 3 is a really great way to keep all of that detail when you're filming, and I use that a lot when I am doing a run and gun, more documentary style shoot outside. Fourth up, the XLRs are now built directly into the camera body, so if you are on a gimbal or a Steadicam or something like that and you want to drop the top handle, you can take it off and know that you can still get high quality audio. And you can now do 4 channels of audio versus on the C100 you can only do 2, and you get those extra 2 channels from the mic input on the side of the camera. Next up, the LCD screen is incredibly adjustable, so you can have it facing towards you in different placements, or depending on how you are hand holding the camera, or if you have it on a tripod, it's just more adjustable. You can put it in more places, and you do have to hit the mirror button anytime you want it to flip orientation, which is kind of annoying when you're used to things like your iPhone just changing automatically for you, but it is nice to be able to put it in a bunch of different arrangements on the camera, depending on how you're filming. At number 6, for things that I like, the Canon C700 was the first Canon camera to film in RAW, and they've brought a version of that down into the C200 with Cinema Raw Lite. This enables you to record a true 4K image, so 17:9, not 16:9 UHD, to a CFast 2.0 card inside of the camera. If you do film in RAW Lite to a CFast 2.0 card and then you put those files on your computer, you can change certain settings about them like you would a raw photo, for example. So you can change the white balance or the white balance tint shift. You can also change the brightness level, the sharpness, and you can change both the color space and gamma profiles. So what this would enable you to do is, if you forgot to change the white balance on one of your shots, or if you wanted to film in Rec 709, but then you wanted to give the files to a colorist and wanted to put it in Canon log 1, 2, or 3, you could then change all those settings to the raw files, and then your editor or colorist could use them in that different format. If you're shooting in Cinema Raw Light on the Canon C200 and you're shooting at 60 frames per second, that will be at 10-bit, and if you're shooting at 30 or 24p, that'll be at 12-bit. The seventh thing I like about this camera is that the slow motion does not crop in on the sensor, and you're able to shoot at 60p in UHD or 4K, and in HD or 1080p, you're able to shoot at 120 frames per second. So you can get some pretty good slow-mo. You do lose a little bit of sharpness, it looks like, from my tests, but overall, pretty good image for the slow motion. I do wish it went a little bit higher, like to 240 frames per second, like I can do on my iPhone. Number 8 is a small thing, but it's just a nice change. On my Canon C100 Mark II, my Rode NTG3 shotgun microphone would not actually fit in the holder for a microphone, but in the Canon C200, it properly fits, which is bueno. Number 9, both the top handle and the side handle are better on the C200 than on a C100. The top handle now screws in with 2 screws, so you don't have that wiggle that you might have on the top handle of a C100, as well as on the side handle, it uses an RE style rosette, so it's easier to use third-party accessories that maybe will move that handle further down for a shoulder mount or what have you, but that is also just a solid attachment on the side handle, so it won't get a rattle. Because on my C100 Mark II, both the top handle and the side handle only kind of have one point that touch on them, so they both rattle as you move them, which is kind of annoying. At number 10, I wouldn't say this camera is the best at low light, but it is really solid. You don't see a lot of those fixed noise patterns going all the way up to about 32,000 ISO. So if you are shooting in a documentary environment or at night at a wedding or event or something like that, and you do need to push the ISO, you get pretty good results out of it. It does go all the way up to, I think, 102,400 if you change it to extended ISO range, but you're probably not going to need to go that high. And last up on this list of things I really like about this camera at number 11 is the ND filters. They're now actual buttons for plus and minus to add and remove 2, 4, or 6 stops of ND, versus on the C100 there was a physical dial, which was a little bit slower to change. And if you go into the extended neutral density range, you can also get 8 or 10 stops of ND if you're filming in a very bright environment and do want to shoot very shallow. Now let's talk about some of the things I'm not a huge fan of in this camera. So this camera only records 8-bit 420 when you're filming to an SD card. And Canon has talked about coming out with an AVC version instead of an MP4 version of files, but even then, it's been confirmed from multiple sources, including places like News Shooter, that you're not going to get 10-bit out of this camera. So if you don't have any idea what that means, it's really just numbers about color sampling and bit depth of colors. And if you are filming stuff that goes straight to the web, you probably don't even need to worry about that at all. You only need to worry about that if you are in broadcast and you're filming for television, or you're filming for Netflix or another place that has really specific rules and guidelines to have a certain amount of bit depth at 10-bit or 12-bit or higher of the image that you're recording. If you are filming for YouTube, this camera makes really good images at that 8-bit at 420. Yes, there are other cameras on the market, like ones from Panasonic in similar price ranges with the EVA1 that's coming out, that will film in 10-bit 422, or even the Panasonic GH5 that also films in 10-bit 422. But really, these are just numbers, and unless you absolutely need those for broadcast standards, I would just say ignore them, test the camera, film it, and look at the image. The image is really, really clean and has an amazing look to it at 420. The second thing I don't like about this camera, and hopefully something that will change in the near future, is you cannot edit natively the Canon Cinema Raw Light files in a program like Adobe Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro 10. Now, you can edit them in DaVinci Resolve or in Avid Media Composer, but for most people doing stuff for the web, you're probably using Premiere or Final Cut. So the workaround for this is you have to use Canon's Cinema Raw development program, either on a Mac or PC, and you have to bring in the files to that, make the changes you want to white balance, sharpness, color space, gamma, those types of things. Then you'll actually have to export those files to use in Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro 10. So you'll export them as ProRes, for example. So that's going to slow down your workflow even more than already shooting RAW and not being able to put it in your program. You now have to export new versions. That's going to take up more hard drive space as well, add more time in the process. So if you're gonna get this camera to shoot RAW, know that for Premiere Pro and Final Cut Pro 10 at the moment here in, I don't know, it's end of September 2017, you can't use it natively in those programs. You're going to have to do some round tripping. And sticking with complaining about this new raw light format, number 3 is this format eats up a ton of data. They say it's 1/3 or 1/5 compression of raw, but a direct quote from Canon on one of their YouTube videos, they said, quote, "A 64 gigabyte CFast card will give you roughly 5 minutes of 23.98p footage before needing to swap." So think about that. 64 gigs is 5 minutes of raw footage. So just looking at my notes, because there's a bunch of math here. So this 256 gigabyte card I rented alongside the camera from Lens Pro to Go retails for $675. And based on Canon's math in that comment there, that's 20 minutes of filming in RAW. So that's about $700 for 20 minutes. I don't know about you, but when I film stuff, I film quite a bit. You know, you're getting a lot of coverage, and especially if you're doing an event like a wedding or a conference or workshop, or you're shooting documentary style, honestly, unless you have a ton of money to put into these CFast 2.0 cards, you're not going to be shooting in RAW. You're going to be shooting straight to the SD card in 8-bit 420 to a 16:9 4K file. Now, for comparison's sake, if you're filming RAW on something like a Red, like I'm filming this on right now, the Red Scarlett W at 4K HD, which is pretty similar to what the Canon Cinema Raw Light would be, you're going to get on a 240 gigabyte mini mag, which is, you know, similar in size to the 256 thing we're getting 20 minutes on, at an 8:1 compression ratio from Red, that is over an hour and a half. It's about 100 minutes of footage that you're going to get to that drive. Now, that thing is also expensive. You know, you're going to spend $1,000 or so on a 240 mini mag from Red, but you're also getting way more time to record, and you can change the compression ratio. So depending on what you're recording, you might want a higher compression ratio if you're filming a movie or a television show. But if you're just filming for the web, you know, you could be down to 18:1. I've seen Sam and Nico talk about their compression ratio, and I've talked on Instagram with Brandon from Linus Tech Tips, and he talks about how they are just using 18:1 compression using Red cameras as well. So you can bring down the compression and change it on a Red camera depending on how much file size you want to take up and how much quality you want in the image. On a Canon Cinema Raw Light, you have no choices. You have to shoot to a CFast 2.0 card, and it's taking up a ton of space. At number 4, now you may think that, okay, I'll just record the RAW separately from the camera like I would on a Canon C500 back in the day to get some solid RAW 4K footage. Well, you can't record RAW out of this camera. You are limited in what you can record. You can't get that Canon Cinema Raw Light or a RAW feed from this camera. On goes my complaining. Number 5, you can't record a proxy file to the second SD card while recording 4K to the other SD card. So on a Canon C100 Mark II, I could record a full quality HD file to one SD card and at the same time be recording a proxy file to the second SD card. This is helpful for recording things and then sending them to my editor, who Tim now lives in Colorado. He's in a different state. So we have a different workflow for how we're sharing video files to each other. And I could do that on the C100. HD to 1 SD card, low res, 720p proxy on the other card. So in the Canon C200, you can record proxies if you're recording Cinema Raw Lite to the CFast 2.0 card, and then putting proxies on the SD card. That is an option. But when you're recording to SD cards, the option to change proxy settings is grayed out. So you can't record 4K to one SD card and low-res proxies to the other. It's just a feature that should be there. I don't know why it isn't. Next, I talked about this a little bit already, but you can only record to MP4 files on the SD cards. You don't get an AVC file type like you do on a Canon C100 or a C300. Canon's still working on making the XF-AVC file format to record to on the C200. Hopefully it will be a free firmware update, but it's not available yet. Another thing is that they took the built-in microphones that were on the Canon C100 Mark II in the top handle, and they're removed completely like on the C300 Mark II. So you don't have built-in microphones that are decent. You do have a scratch track built into the camera body, but you're going to be plugging microphones into this thing if you want any audio at all. At number 8, you cannot output from the HDMI port and the SDI port at the same time, which to me makes no sense. Why have both ports if you're not going to allow me to use both of them? So if you're used to using, let's say, HDMI as an additional monitor to make sure what you're filming is in focus and exposed correctly, but then maybe you're running an SDI cable back to a monitor that the director is looking at and the other side of the room. You can't even output from both of them. And the SDI is only in HD. It's only in 2K or 1080p. It's not in 4K, which is what you'd be filming in. So you can get 4K from the HDMI port, but I'd prefer an SDI port because it has a locking part to it. You can run longer cables. So it doesn't make sense why you can't use both of those ports to me. And the ninth thing here is you can't use autofocus modes when you're in slow motion. So if you change the camera to slow motion, your touchscreen autofocus, your tracking, all that stuff just completely goes away. You cannot use any of the autofocus modes when you are in slow motion, and you also don't get any sound at all. It would be nice if you had real-time sound in case you just decided to play back that clip in real time and you didn't want it in slow motion, but you can't. Now, who is this camera for and who is it not for? I think this is the perfect camera for someone that has a successful event-based videography business. It is $7,500, so it's not an entry-level camera for someone starting out just shooting weddings or events or trying to tell documentary stories. So it's not entry-level per se, but if you're an established business, maybe you've been filming on 5Ds or Sony cameras, or you have C100s and you've liked using those, this would be a good step up because you're jumping to 4K, you have the touchscreen autofocus, and you have some better slow-mo options. And overall, this camera is just a little bit better built. It's a little bit more rugged for doing documentary style shooting, for doing event shooting all the time, every weekend, going to the weddings on your feet all day. But I don't think that this is going to be for someone that knows what the difference between 8-bit and 10-bit and 12-bit is for the color bit depth of what they're recording. If you do have to put stuff on broadcast occasionally, you have to shoot Cinema Raw Lite to get to a bit rate, and then you have to deal with that workflow. So I would recommend, if you are an event shooter or you want to shoot documentaries, or maybe you're a YouTuber and you're just doing web content and you want a solid studio or run and gun camera, the Canon C200 is a really good option, and the autofocus features are really, really good. And I don't think I talked about that enough in this video, but the autofocus ability, the touchscreen, the face tracking, the object tracking, that sort of thing really simplifies doing filming with a still lens like the whole Canon EF line of photo lenses that a lot of people are using to film videos. Another group I didn't really touch on would be filmmakers or people making short films. If you are going to be using this on a movie or television set, you're going to want to be shooting in cinema raw light, and you're just going to need to know that you're going to need a lot of CFast 2.0 cards. And until this is supported in Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro 10, you are going to be having to use Canon software to do some round tripping to get the ProRes files into the software to do the editing. So if you have that amount of time, or you have someone that's going to be managing your files, or you don't mind doing it yourself, and you want a really high quality image, this camera can give it to you. But you are going to have to be shooting on those CFast 2.0 cards. Now, it would be impossible for me to do this review not knowing what the other options were for people that are in this price point and are looking to get a camera. So comparing this to my Canon C100 Mark II, which I got a used one for about $3,500. My second one, my first one, I spent $5,500 on in like January 2015 or so. And so knowing that the C100 Mark II is about half the price of a C200, if you really need 4K, you're going to go C200. If you have the extra money and you're trying to get a good main camera with some autofocus features, the C200 is worth it. If you don't need 4K and you don't need touchscreen autofocus, the C100 Mark II is still an amazing event and documentary filmmaking camera, in my opinion. I still grab it when I'm filming online courses for people, or I'm doing run and gun stuff, or I need to be recording for a long period of time and I don't want to bring out a RED camera with a lot of large file sizes. You know, it's still a really good camera. So I would just think about whether or not you need 4K to film people's weddings or to film conferences and that sort of stuff. I don't have any clients asking me for 4K right now. I know people say that all the time as an excuse for not upgrading their cameras, but truly, no one that I've worked with so far in the past 3 years of running my business full time has needed a 4K file. Comparing this C200 to its older brother, the C300 Mark II, which now the price is about $10,000 US, used to be $16,000 at launch. The C300 Mark II is an amazing camera. It has a lot of the features of the C200, including the object tracking and the face tracking autofocus, and it just doesn't have that cinema raw ability. But what you do get with the C300 Mark II is you do get those broadcast level bit rates, bit depths, whatever, 10 bit to go to broadcast from that camera. So if you are doing anything that's going on television, you're probably going to know already that you do need broadcast quality stuff. If you are doing stuff just for the web, don't worry about that. The C200 is probably the camera for you just because it's a little cheaper. Comparing the Canon C200 to a RED camera is a little ridiculous because they're different types of cameras, but I'm only doing so because this has RAW in it and RED has RAW, just like Blackmagic has cameras that shoot RAW as well. But like I talked about in the file size difference, RED RAW is just a better format than Cinema Raw Lite. And you also can change things like ISO with RED Code RAW, and Red Cine X is just a much better, more developed program than Canon's Cinema Development RAW development program, as well as you can natively play back and change the RED RAW settings in something like Premiere Pro or Final Cut Pro 10. So if you're wanting to go the raw route, raw video route, I would recommend RED. On the budget level, you could get into RAW with a Blackmagic camera like the Ursa Mini Pro, I believe, or maybe even the Ursa Mini has RAW. I've never shot with an Ursa Mini. I've just used the Blackmagic like studio cameras that look like a big iPad you slap a Micro Four Thirds lens to. But if you're going to go RAW, I would just say make the investment and the push towards RED. The convolutedness of this is really not worth the effort to me right now. Now, there are a bunch of other cameras you can compare this to. You can compare it to the Ursa Mini Pro. You can compare it to Panasonic's new EVA-1, which a lot of people will compare it to. because that camera uses EF lenses, has a 5.7K sensor, has a lot of the output abilities that you might want from SDI and HDMI, and people are going to compare that camera to this a lot, but until that thing's out, I don't feel comfortable comparing it to that. So this compared to an EVA-1, you're just going to have to wait. Also, there are two camera models of the C200. There's the regular one that comes with a viewfinder. It comes with the LCD screen and the top handle and the mic holder and that sort of thing. And then there's the C200B, which is actually $1,500 cheaper, and it doesn't have a viewfinder. It doesn't come with an LCD or a top handle. And that would be more used for gimbal or drone work. And then to actually see what's on there, you would use your own external monitor attached to the top of the gimbal via SDI or HDMI, or you might use the Canon web browser and get a preview on your phone or your laptop of what the camera is seeing. So know that there are those two versions. Most people are going to get the main one and have the electronic viewfinder, the LCD screen, and the top handle. Another long review from me. I can't really review a cinema camera from Canon without making it a very long video, because I do get into all the technical things about bit rates and file types and autofocus and features and what I like and don't like and how does this compare to other cameras, because this is an investment. This is a $7,500 investment in your business to hopefully make better images or to make your job easier when you're filming them. And this thing does a pretty good job. As much as I've harped on it about the Cinema Raw Lite in comparison to something like Red Raw and some of the shortcomings of outputs and things like that, if I was not going the Red route for what I wanted to film and I was continuing to stick with Canon cinema cameras, this is a good upgrade from the Canon C100 Mark II. The jump to 4K, it's a beautiful image. The autofocus abilities are really great. Those two things alone would make my job much easier, and I would make better images, and I would probably be upgrading if this thing had been announced before my Red arrived, just because I love using Canon cinema cameras. They are just so quick and simple to use. The files are small and manageable, but they're high quality, and I can use all of my Canon EF lenses, record audio internally, pack it up in a backpack. It's not super heavy. I really do like these Canon cinema cameras, but there are some shortcomings with this. It should be 10-bit. I know they don't want to take stuff away from the Canon C300 Mark II, but it should be 10-bit. Canon Cinema Raw Lite, once that's integrated into Premiere, might be singing a different tune, but the round tripping right now would not be worth it to me to film in that format, as well as using that much data to film things would not be worth it to me either. If you've made it this far and you're still undecided about the Canon C200 and whether it's right for you or not, check out my C100 Mark II review, where I break down that camera and talk about the pros and cons of it and upgrading from a DSLR to using a video camera. Because if you're on a budget, this is maybe out of your league or it's too expensive. C100 Mark II, still a great HD 1080p camera. Thanks so much for watching. I've been Wojcik of DIY Video Guy, and see you in the next review.